This episode of the podcast is sponsored by ARO Resources in honor of the podcast. In general, I just want to say a word about sponsorships and support of the podcast. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode, you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or I'll put a link in the show's notes through the website. There's through PayPal, but you can email me for other ways besides PayPal. And in general, especially for new listeners or others, you can sponsor an episode or just in general support the podcast in any way. I am looking into doing a number of different things to expand the podcast. As I've said on here, and it was in that Mishpacha article, there is a series on Spain coming. It's going to be after Shavuos, Eretz Hashem. I know it was supposed to be after Pesach, but some things came up. It's going to be after Shavuos, Eretz Hashem. And there's another series coming soon on the Asar Shvatim, 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. That'll be after. And different figures in Jewish history involved with this. It's not really looking for them, just to be clear. As well as there are some other things I'm looking to do, branch out, start some new things with the podcast as well. So, any support is really very helpful because there's a number of different things I'm trying to do for the podcast that monetary support will be helpful for. So if anyone is, again, you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can, again, go to the link. And any support, again, is very much appreciated. I do appreciate all listeners who have sponsored episodes and have supported the episode, even not a full sponsorship. It's very much appreciated. Also, and I say this again, because I know there are some new listeners, especially since the Mishpacha piece, just in general, I'm always open to guest suggestions. I've gotten a number actually recently over the past 2 weeks, and very interesting ones. So I'm always open to that, and you can email me that as well. Again, svarimchatter@gmail.com. You can email me. You can actually also email nachi@svarimchatter.com. Works as well. So any suggestions or comments, feedback, I'm getting some good feedback, different, things people like or don't like, especially if you're a new listener. And the old listeners, I'm sure I've heard from you. I've heard from a lot of you, or I'm sure you know what works, what doesn't work, what you like, what you don't like at this point. But if you're a new listener, you like something, you don't like something, let me know. I can't promise, but I can try to incorporate different things. Try to, the feedback and the critique, positive and negative, really helps to improve the podcast. So that's something that's helpful as well. And another thing, a lot of listeners I want to thank have rated the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify as well. But Apple Podcasts review really helps. If you write a short review and a rating, and if you can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, very much appreciate that as well. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rav Shnayor Burton, who is the mechaber of a number of Svarim, and he's been on the podcast before. And we just published a brand new sefer titled Sefer HaAretz Asher Arecha, in mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So this is something that Rav Burton was on the podcast previously talking about his podcast series on this. I think before it came out, the podcast series, and now there's a full sefer on the topic. So we're going to talk about the sefer this time. So thank you, Rav Shnayor, for joining me once again.
Nachi, it is a pleasure to be here. And this is a subject I've been talking about nonstop now for a few years. And I'm so excited to talk to your audience about it. I'm so passionate about this and would love to talk about it.
Yes, that you are. And anyone that knows you or, knows that this is something you're extremely passionate about. Okay, so I want to start off. I'm actually going to I read a little tiny excerpt from the sefer just to clarify right here. As you put this in the sefer, you put a disclaimer and saying, I want to just jump right into this. Ein ha-sefer oisik b'shailas Medinas Yisrael. The sefer is not busy with the shaila of the Medina, of the government of Israel. Loi minei v'loi b'ksasa. Loi b'hakamasa oz v'loi b'tzarfus eleh hayoim b'matzav ha'noichechi ela b'mitzvahs ha'yishuv Eretz Yisrael atzma. So basically, essentially, you're giving a disclaimer. I'll let you talk more about your own disclaimer, but just the same thing for the podcast. Essentially, this is, people might think, but this is about the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. Nothing to do with the Israeli government, the state of Israel. It's the land of Eretz Yisrael, so to speak. And you can talk more about it. Just so we wanted to clarify that right away in the beginning so people can understand what the podcast is about and really understand what the sefer is really about and trying to do.
Exactly. And one of the challenges about this subject is that there's a lot of confusion, as you mentioned, in people's minds. And what I've tried to do in the sefer is say, let's focus on one thing. So I even end the introduction, if I may read another excerpt, it's on the same page, where I say that the purpose of this book, the purpose of the Sefer, is to determine what I hope to be a final answer and a clear answer to one very simple question. Ha'im aleinu ladur be'Eretz Yisrael. And everything I treat of in the Sefer, including a lot of Agadata, and in the 7th section of the Sefer, I deal with the concept of Eretz Yisrael, the idea of Eretz Yisrael, why is it important? It's only because it's necessary to determine whether we should or should not live there. So I'm looking to answer that question on its own terms. And of course, I'm not going to answer whether a person feels like, well, he's going to be spiritually, he's going to suffer spiritually because of the culture there or because of the government. We can't answer every single question when we're dealing with a topic, right? If someone's writing a sefer about tefillah, he doesn't deal with the question, well, what if I have a mitzvah that's deicha tefillah? Like, that's not what this is about. So I want to focus in the sefer on just the yeshiva be'Eretz Yisrael in and of itself. Interestingly enough, that disclaimer was inserted there, but the encouragement of my dear brother-in-law, Shmuel Yaakov Gibber, who I thank him in the introduction for reviewing the sefer. And I think it was on his encouragement that I added that. Not that I didn't mean that till he suggested it, but he felt like it should be made clear because of this confusion that people have. And there's nothing about the government here. There's nothing about Bechiris or the Knesset or all these very important questions. But we have to be able to think about the core issue. And then we can think about those ancillary issues that may bear on a particular individual.
Absolutely. And that's why I want to just come up with the disclaimer. And now, like you said, the question of, you're seeking to answer the question of, should we live in Eretz Yisrael? I mean, that's two people here having a conversation. I'm in Lakewood, the Lakewood area, and you're in Brooklyn, New York. And so neither of us are in Eretz Yisrael. I don't think either of us seem to be picking up to Eretz Yisrael tomorrow. Maybe you are. We'll talk about it. So that's interesting. They're both different on the topic. I think we covered that in the last episode we talked about, but we can get more into that. So, okay, let's start off like this. Just a general overview. I mean, it's something you do right away in the beginning. We talk about the mitzvah. I mean, it says it on the cover, mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. What is that mitzvah? Where does it come from? The Makar, give us a overview, just in brief, of this mitzvah.
So there are really two approaches, and I take both approaches in the Sefer. One approach is, well, we'll find it in the Taryag mitzvahs. And in fact, the Ramban does count it as a mitzvah. And the other approach, which in my opinion is more important than that approach, because of all the people who counted the mitzvahs, and there were many of them, the Ramban is the only one that counted it as one of the mitzvahs. So another approach is to say, this is a very great mitzvah because of all the things that Chazal say about it, because of all the psukim about it. So those are basically, when we talk about, like, on the cover, as you said, I talk about mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I'm not taking a stand in the title about whether it's a mitzvah of the 613 mitzvahs, but I am taking a stand that it's a mitzvah to think about it, a mitzvah as in something important to do, something important to think about. So those are the two approaches. And Chelik Aleph, a lot of the first section, the book is divided into 7 chalakim. And a lot of the Chelik Aleph is devoted to really dealing with this question of whether, if it's not a mitzvah, an official mitzvah of the Taryag mitzvahs, how do we determine whether we should do it or not? And I go into this point about how even if it's not an official mitzvah of the count, the wonderful things that Chazal teach us about it, if they're actually going to work, if we're going to live in Eretz Yisrael and not do Averis, or if, as Yehuda Levi says, the Geula depends on us moving to Eretz Yisrael, well, then that is reason to go there, if you really believe that. And if you really understand that, if you're really able to apply that. So that's the other aspect, the other angle why we might call it a mitzvah, because it's so important. But that's a very interesting kind of mitzvah, because it sort of depends on maybe your circumstances, maybe if it will work for you, maybe if you'll understand it. And I know from a lot of listeners, and I've been getting a lot of feedback from some of the shiurim and some of my writings, people have a little bit of a problem understanding that. Like, how could you say something is a mitzvah only if you understand it? What do you mean by that? And that's very subtle. I'll just, as you said, I'll keep it brief at this point, but that's in Chelik Aleph, Perek Daled, which is entitled Gidra Shel Mitzvah. The Geder, the definition of a mitzvah, what makes something a mitzvah? When you have something important to do, but the Torah doesn't command it in the imperative, that doesn't mean it's any less important than something the Torah does command as an imperative. So those are the two lines of attack when we're thinking about living in Israel as a mitzvah.
Okay, and of course the episode is just kind of like the Cliff Notes version, I guess, of the Sefer, not the actual. Now there's an actual Sefer that people can purchase, and I'll put a link in the show's notes. It's not just a podcast form; they can listen to your podcast also. But now we have the actual Sefer. Okay, so this goes right away into the second chelik, as you call it. Kind of, I guess you kind of called it. Each chelik is almost like a large perek, and then there's like smaller prakim in there. So what you call the chelik. The second chelik is the Shalosh Shavuos. Listeners, people may be familiar with that. Gemara and Ksubis, and it's something you did on Old Daf. I think by Ksubis you did a shir on this with Moshe Shwed, and in general this comes right away to the Satmar Rav and the Satmar shitah as well. So let's talk about that, because that goes right in well. Is it a mitzvah with the mitzvah, and then we get right away in the Gemara and Ksubis and it's Asher. So let's explain to listeners, those not familiar, what the Shalosh Shavuos is, the Gemara and the Ksubis, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay, so like you said, I wanted to make this for advance and move along from one topic to the next to give the readers, the students, the chachamim who will engage in this topic, I'm trying to give them everything they're going to need. As I said, to answer really one simple question, but I want to give them all the angles. So that's why I started with, okay, is it a mitzvah? So what does that mean that it's a mitzvah? And then, as you said, you establish that it's a mitzvah, very important, but then you have this Gemara that says it's an Avera. So that's my chelik base dealing with this Gemara in Ksubis. The Gemara says that, based on the Psukim and Shir, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu adjured Bnei Yisrael, he made them swear that they won't be oile b'choima, that they won't go back to Eretz Yisrael, kachoima or bachoim, that's a question of the Girsa, by force, en masse. And there's another version of the oaths in the Medrash that Bnei Yisrael sworn that they won't build the Beis HaMikdash before there's a voice from heaven. So you have this Gemara, which basically saying that something which is the greatest mitzvah, a great mitzvah, such as building the Beis HaMikdash, living in Israel, is actually a great Avera. And the Gemara says the worst punishments for this is that if a person, if Klal Yisrael will chas v'shalom do this, Hashem will make their blood hefker like wild animals. So famously, Satmar Rav in the V'yoyim Moshe holds that these oaths forbid the enterprise of establishing a large community in Eretz Yisrael. And that's something I deal with at great length in Chelik Beis. And my conclusion that I explained there is that, in fact, the Shavuos reflect the idea behind the Shavuos, because you think about it, it's a very strange thing. Why would it be forbidden to do these important mitzvahs? So what I demonstrate there is that the idea behind the Shavuos is that it would be very dangerous for Klal Yisrael to attempt to return to Eretz Yisrael before the global community, the other nations, are willing to accept that. And that basically all those oaths are about this idea that the status of the Jewish people among the nations of the world is quite fraught and unstable. And our dreams of redemption have to be managed carefully. Otherwise, they're going to provoke the nations and lead to a backlash of anti-Semitism. And once you understand the Gemara that way, that's based on the Rambam in the Geras Taimon, says that basically explicitly. And in fact, interesting story is that the day that the Sefer was going to go to print, it must have been 9 or 10 months since I'd finished writing it. It took a long time for the editing and the typesetting, cover design, and I think it paid off because it's really beautiful. Great thanks to Misha Beletsky, did a beautiful job, and to my editor, Moshe David Chechik. So it must have been, I think, 9 or 10 months since I added anything of substance to the Sefer. And it was going to go to print that day. And that the day that I was going to go to print, literally that day, it occurred to me a great proof to the Rambam, and probably the Rambam source. The Rambam says in the Igeres Taimon, I took that as a sign of hashgacha, actually, because I felt with the fact that nothing had occurred to me until the day I was going to go to print, and I spoke to the printer. He said, it's okay, we can still put it in. And by the way, this paragraph I'm about to paraphrase for you, I can tell you where it is. It's on top of page Chav Zayin. That top paragraph, there was the addition that I put in. He said we could still move things around. And that was a source for the Rambam. The Rambam in the Igeres Taimon says that Shlomo Melech predicted or foresaw through his Ruach HaKodesh that the nation, the Jewish nation, will attempt to get out of exile before it's time, before it's appropriate. And because of that, they will suffer. And therefore, says the Rambam, he commanded them to be careful, and he made them swear as a mashal, and he said ishbatias. So what the Rambam is saying is that the shavuos are not what creates the danger. It's the opposite. It's the danger that's inherent in Bnei Yisrael, attempting to go to Eretz Yisrael, attempting to bring Mashiach, attempting to build a Beis Hamikdash. It's the natural danger that's inherent in that was foreseen by Shlomo Melech. And reflecting that, he said these shvuos, which are a mashal, warning us to be very careful. Okay, and soon we'll talk about, so what does that mean for Lamaisa, halacha Lamaisa? But what I realized was that there's actually a source that's really an explicit source for the Rambam, because in the Medrash and Shir Shirim, one of the opinions about the shvuos is that there are shvuos that are repeated numerous times in Shir Shirim. In one count, it's 4 times. And the Medrash says that the 4 times that it's repeated reflect the 4 times that the oaths were transgressed. And it gives 4 times in history that the shvuos were breached. Bar Kochba is the famous one, and the Bnei Ephraim who left Mitzrayim early. So 4 times where people tried to hasten the redemption before it was time. Now, if you think about it, we never find that an Avera should be repeated according to the number of times that it was transgressed, right? Like, Torah says, "L'seichel al dam" so many times, and that's not because that's how many times they did it, because they're never supposed to do it. Why would the Torah repeat something numerous times, connected the amount of times that it's going to be broken? They're never supposed to break it. You're never supposed to break in this. This is the source of the Rambam. These psukim are a prediction. There are going to be 4 times where Klal Yisrael is going to face this danger, and Shlomo Melech is warning us: avoid this. Be careful. Don't fall into that trap that I foresee 4 times in the future. This is an open mucker. It's a really clear source to the Rambam's understanding of the shvuos. Satmar Rav, on the other hand, considers the shvuos to be something that creates an isser, because he understands the shvuos as warning us that we are not supposed to take redemption into our own hands due to religious reasons, because we have to believe that Mashiach is going to redeem us, that Hashem is going to redeem us, that we can only be redeemed when we do tshuva. Those kinds of considerations that determine the nature of our religious obligation to wait for the geula. What we see from the Rambam Igeres Taimon is that this is not a religious matter; it's a matter of danger. Now, of course, danger is no less important. In fact, danger is obviously the most important thing, and that's why the Gemara warns us against this. Right? It's so chomer because it's a concept fascist. But what I argue in my sefer is that once we understand the oaths correctly, and it's a matter of danger and not of isser, then we have to think about, well, is there a danger today? Okay. And that's a very interesting question. That's a very important question. And then we have to think, well, is there a danger in what? Is there a danger from you and I to move to Eretz Yisrael? Certainly not. Right? Is there a danger for every single Jew to pick up and say, we're done with America, we're done with Galus, we don't want to have anything to do with any country but for Israel? Yeah, that might be dangerous. That might be a bad idea politically, and it might be dangerous for the Jewish people. And that's why I'm only writing my sefer, because I don't think everyone's going to read it and do it. If I thought that every single Jew is going to do it, I might think twice, okay? Because I'm not trying to bring, quote unquote, the geula. I am, but I'm not, right? Because, in other words, the world is not ready for the full message of geula. Of course, we're trying to bring the geula, but if you push one part of it before the other, right? So let's say you say, we're the chosen people, right? Okay, but do you want to talk about that until you understand that? Do you want to talk about that until you could explain that to the world? Right? That's like a dechikas haketz. don't push the idea of sovereignty for the Jewish people, of Jews being sovereign, if the world is not ready for it.
So you mentioned their gullus. I want to get to that. That's another thing that you talk about here. But before that, you end off this perek, chilek, whatever you want to call it, chapter, let's just say, with a quote from Amir Simcha of Dvinsk, from the, if you want to talk about it, there's a Mer.
Mm-hmm. Right, there's a letter from Amir Simcha, a fascinating letter, where he says that after the Balfour Declaration, where the nations gave us permission to go back to Eretz Yisrael, so he uses this expression. He says, "Sar pachad hashuas." The fear of the shvuas is gone, and that's such an interesting expression. And this idea, actually, my Talmud and Chavrusa, with whom I studied this in Mikey Stone, I give him credit for this thought. He said, "Look, Rameir Simcha talks about the fear of the shvuas, because the Gemara frightens us. The Gemara talks about how dangerous it is. Now, if something's an aver, you don't talk about the fear. You talk about, is it an aver or not? Rameir Simcha is a great paisik, a great gaon. He should talk about whether something is mutter or aser, whether it's included in the parameters of the aser or not. And yet Rameir Simcha says, look, they're letting us go, and therefore the pachad of the shvuas, the fear of the shvuas is gone. So you see, he understood the Gemara. He related to the Gemara as being a matter of something. The Gemara is warning us that we should be very afraid. And we shouldn't think, oh no, everything's going to be fine. We're going to go back to Eretz Yisrael. Hashem's going to protect us because we're doing God's work. No, you have to be afraid. You have to be careful. And I also show that the Argadol, the Mitzvah Gadol, also treats the Shavuos in the same way. He says it's a matter of danger. So these great Gainim were yared to the Indian in great depth. By the way, I just want to bring attention to everyone. I'm very proud of the index. Have you seen the index here? It's a great index, if I may say so myself.
Yeah, you can mention it now, or I was going to get to it later. I was going to get to more technical things at the end, or we'll get to it.
Because we're going in order, and I want to point that out now, because in case we don't get there.
Yeah, sure. And we don't only have to go strictly in order. We're not going to get to everything in the Sefer, but just, going off something that you mentioned gullus, and that's something that you go to next. But I think it's just also very interesting to discuss, as you say. A very important part of this is the haftacha of Eretz Yisrael to Bnei Yisrael, and then the gzeira of gullus from it, and then so one versus the other, and then we're going back during gullus to Eretz Yisrael. While it is gullus, so we're exiled from that. We're going back. It all ties in. So I don't know what more you want to say on this.
Right. I had this experience, and this is part of the reason why I decided to go into this, to study this subject. And I'm curious if you feel the same way. It sounds like you feel the same way. I felt like there was a lot of confusion about ideas, right? Because like what you just said is like, okay, basically you're saying, how do we untie this knot? Like, okay, there's a mitzvah, it's special to Eretz, but then we're supposed to be in gullus, right? And I don't like being confused. I don't like that state of mind where I'm just like these weird ideas that are not worked out. And it took a lot of work for me personally till I felt like I could unravel, like, okay, what exactly is bothering me? And then what exactly is the solution here? And I went over this so many times. I spent a really long time on this. And like these kinds of subtle questions, simply, I found that they would simply require a lot of time to think about till you realize, like, how to think about them. So, and I hope, and that's what I tried to accomplish with this work, is to give Talmidei Chachamim and even not such Talmidei Chachamim alike the all the information in one place, so that they could think about it and they could learn about it. And that aspect you just raised. So that's like the third aspect I get to my Sefer, third Chelek, which just talks about, the decree of Galus. What do we do with that? And when I say what do we do with that, I want to restate that, because it sounds like I'm trying to resolve everything. I'm not. I went into this with an open mind to see which way it falls, what to make of the Gzeira, the decree of Galus. And the Satmar Rav again, and the reason why we go Satmar Rav is because he wrote the book about it. He really wrote the book on this matter. The Yom Moshe is a Einish book. My conclusions are very different. That's what I'm putting forth in the Sefer for the Rabbanim V'Talmidei Dehain. But it's an amazing work, which I went through numerous times. And he he argues basically that since Hashem decreed Galus on Klal Yisrael, A, and B, Galus has a purpose. It's purposeful. It does, and he goes into what the purpose of galus is. Because of those two reasons, because of A, it's a decree, and B, it's for a good purpose, it's impossible that there should be a mitzvah b'zman hazeh. And even though the Ramban says that there is a mitzvah b'zman hazeh, says the Satmar Rav, it cannot mean that there's a mitzvah for an individual to actually go up and move to Eretz Yisrael b'zman hazeh. That can't be, because you have this decree of galus that conflicts with that. What the Ramban must mean is that if someone finds himself in Eretz Yisrael, he's mekayim a mitzvah. That's his approach. What I show in the Sefer, firstly, there's a tshuva of the Rashbash, who was a descendant of the Ramban, and this is on the top of page Memches. This is in Chelik Gimel, I'm calling it Perek Gimel, where he paraphrases the Ramban and he says, "Mitzvah kol yachid la'alois lo dorsham." Says explicitly, it's a mitzvah for a yachid to ascend and live there. And the reason why I said it's a mitzvah for a yachid is because the tzibur as a whole cannot do it in those times, right? So even when the tzibur cannot do it, it's still a mitzvah on the yachid. So clearly they consider a mitzvah despite the fact that there's a quote-unquote gzeiros galus. So what do we make of that? So what I show in the Sefer is that when you talk about, let's say, Hashem decreed galus against us, did he tell us to go to galus? He didn't command us to leave Eretz Yisrael, right? How was the gzeiros galus executed? Through reality, through war, through the reality of exile, not the command of exile. So when we talk about gzeiros galus, we talk about a decree of exile. What that means is that we have to understand that the fact that Bnei Yisrael was exiled from their land is part of the divine plan, decreed as a punishment for our sins. And as a punishment for our sins, it has purpose. One of the purposes is that it atones. However, it's not something that we are supposed to embrace, and it's not an action that we are supposed to uphold through our own actions. That's what mitzvahs are. Mitzvahs are commandments that we're supposed to do. Gzeiros from Hashem are things that Hashem does for his reasons. The fact that Hashem does something and the fact that he has reasons to do it doesn't mean we can't be commanded to embrace the opposite. Like, for example, if there's a gzeiros, I give this example in the Sefer. At the time that Yerushalayim was being conquered by the Bavliim, say, if there's a fellow Jew who's at risk of being killed by a Babylonian soldier, there's a law in the Torah, the Satmar Rav, and you have to save his life. And if someone were to say, well, how could there be a mitzvah to save his life if Yirmiyah Hanavi said that the Chil Bavli is going to come and attack us, so there's a gzeiros misa? It's like, no, you know what? If Hashem wants to kill him, we'll kill him, and we'll explain why. We'll say it's a kapara and all that. That doesn't talk to mitzvahs. So that's a category of confusion there. Gzeiros of Hashem don't talk to mitzvahs, because gzeiros of Hashem, whenever we use the word gzeira, we mean something that Hashem decreed because he did it. Hashem doesn't decree things that he doesn't do. That's called a mitzvah when he tells us to do something. Unless you argue that there's a mitzvah to be in galus. Unless you argue that there's a mitzvah to be in galus, then there's no conflict at all. So it's interesting. It's like when it came to a subject like this, you have these ideas that are banging around in people's heads, and they're very confusing to get around. It took a while to get around that. That's my conclusion. It's presented there.
Yeah, that is interesting. Now you mentioned something over there where you said, you're not as a tzibur, like a yachid, a single person, and each of us should go to Eretz Yisrael, or we can go, whatever. What do you mean by that? Do you just mean not a tzibur as a whole, or it's any one of us, or is it something? Or you should be a tzaddik? Is it meant for special people? What do you mean there exactly?
Okay. So when we talk about not a tzibur, so I was quoting the Rashbash. The Rashbash considered it impossible for the tzibur to go, and he considered it impossible for the tzibur to go because of the shvuos, which in light of the Rambam, and we don't find anyone that argues on that from the Rishonim, that is, in light of the Rambam means the Rashbash considered it to be dangerous, impossible in the sense that it would be ineffective, and it would be have a negative effect on Klal Yisrael if they were to all attempt to go back to Yisrael in his times. So that's what he means when he says that tzibur can't all go. Okay, so the tzibur can't all go, that would be dangerous, but individuals could go. Now, it's very important to realize, like a lot of things in the sugya, I'm not looking to define a term exactly, because this is not a law in the Torah, right? When the Torah says, we need to define terms very well. What's levisha, what shatnez, what's halah, and so on and so forth. This is reality. Eretz Yisrael is important. Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah. Geula depends on us returning to Eretz Yisrael, but there's a reality that we can't go back. A danger in all of us going back. So a yachid could go back. What does that mean? That means there's no danger. And by the way, not to get too much into the sugya and ksubis, those who know that Gemara, there's a machlekes of Yehuda and Reb Zera. Reb Yehuda considers that even an individual shouldn't go back because of the shvuas, and Reb Zera says no, only the tzibur can't go back. So what that means is that Yehuda says, since there's a matter of danger, if we'll try to hasten the geula, it's better for nobody to engage in Eretz Yisrael in chibas haaretz b'payil, going back to Eretz Yisrael, because of the risk of the danger that could bring onto the tzibur. But otherwise, if you think about, okay, is the individual endangering anyone? No, he's not. Okay. The other point you raised, though, is, okay, well, maybe it's only for certain individuals. And this is another thing that Satmar Rav does a lot about. He says Eretz Yisrael is only for tzaddikim. This takes us to the end of Chelik Gimel. There's a chapter there titled Hayim Eretz Yisrael Miyuchedes Rak LaTzaddikim. He makes a big deal out of this. Someone has to be a very great tzaddik for him to be deserving of living in Israel. And in fact, there are sources in the Rishonim and Achronim that suggest that only a tzaddik, not suggest, say it explicitly, that only a tzaddik should belong in Eretz Yisrael. If you look on page Samach Beis, being from the Sefer HaAretz, that's a very reliable psak sefer from Danzig, who says, Dafka mishi yesh biyadai lekadesh es atzmo l'stahir v'lavad Hashem tamid b'chol libay. And he says the following shocking statement: someone who's not going to sanctify himself and purify himself in Eretz Yisrael, it's better that he shouldn't ascend. So here we get a very interesting thing. And this has to do with the point we started with, that we're not talking about a mitzvah, an official mitzvah like taking a lulav. We're talking about a concept that involves aliyah ruchnis. If one's going to argue that you should go to Eretz Yisrael because you're going to become holier there, because it's going to lead you closer to Hashem, to dveikus, to ruchnis, to avodah, well, then the corollary to that is that a person who won't have that kind of aliyah ruchnis, in the words of the Sefer HaAretz, mishe'einu miskadesh u'mistaher mutav shelo yala. Because if Eretz Yisrael is a value because of its spiritual benefits, then if you have an individual who's not going to gain from living there, maybe better that he shouldn't go. Why should he go make it worse for everyone else? Why should he go defile the land? What I show in the Sefer is that these sources that discuss living in Eretz Yisrael are talking about a different reality than the one that faces us today. Because they're talking about individuals ascending, living in Eretz Yisrael as individuals. And I show from the Kuzri that when we think about living in Eretz Yisrael and what the purpose of Eretz Yisrael, we have to always think about it as tzvei dinim. There's Eretz Yisrael for individuals, which was the reality for hundreds, you could say thousands of years, that there wasn't, well, maybe not, but that there weren't full communities there. And there's a question of, should an individual go? Sometimes people will go b'seif yamehem and live out their years in Eretz Yisrael, but without their families, without their parnasa, without everything. And then there's the question of, well, what if you can have a community there? What if the tzibur could go back to Eretz Yisrael? And the question of Eretz Yisrael is different for an individual than for a tzibur. And the reason is because if you think about what will the tzibur get from living in Eretz Yisrael, if you think about, will the tzibur have an aliyah ruchnis from going to Eretz Yisrael? If the answer to that is yes, then the tzibur is encouraged to go, and the particular yechidim don't have to all be tzaddikim. Every tzibur is made up of all sorts of people. So you have to approach the sources, and that's why I was really interested in this sugya, is because it's such a dynamic sugya. It's not so technical, right? It's more about understanding these broad ideas. So you have these sources that say very explicitly that only tzaddikim should go there, and in my opinion, which I'm very certain that this is the correct, and I hope people engage with it and criticize if they think I'm wrong, only applies to the question of should people go to Eretz Yisrael as individuals. But once we talk about the community living in Eretz Yisrael, the community will have an aliyah ruchnis by going to Eretz Yisrael, even if not every individual of that community is on that level. Was I clear? It's a little complicated.
I think so. I guess we'll hear from the listeners. So it's funny. I don't know if this is the way you structured it. Like, this leads me into the Chelik Rubi in the fourth chapter. And I'm not trying actually to go in order here. It's just literally, so the next thing you talk about is something really should up is that, you know, as you titled it, Am Yisrael b'chutz la'aretz darish le'shavel Eretz Yisrael. So I mean, the question becomes then, if this is such an important mitzvah, like you're talking about, it's a mitzvah, and all you're saying. So why didn't generations of people go back to Eretz Yisrael? So is the part of the answer what you're saying, the tzibur versus the yachid thing? Is that part of the answer to this question?
Exactly. It certainly is a major part of it. Yes. And obviously I did structure the Sefer that way, one thing leading into the other. And I think also this is also another good example of the kind of things that were bouncing around in my head and most people, right? And most people's heads, like, okay, it's so important, but what do you mean? But people didn't go, right? And there's no problem in learning that can't be tackled if you structure it properly. Okay. But when you're walking around with these different conflicting ideas that are fighting and they can't even articulate themselves properly, then you're doomed. So I feel that's one of the great values of the Sefer is that it gives each thing its place. And, the question of why didn't they go is going to be treated like a proper raya, like any other raya, right? The same way you might be a raya from a Tosfos, from a Rambam. So this is a raya. The fact that there were so many dairies where people didn't take the opportunity to go, that's a raya, like a raya from a text, maybe a better raya. Maybe a raya what the halacha is, but a raya what Gedolim did. So what I deal with over there is really interesting. It's the Avnei Nezer who did this first. He says, look, if you want to talk about why the tzibur didn't go, that's not a kasha. And the reason why it's not a kasha is because of Yehuda Levi and the Kuzri says to the king, who says to him, if Eretz Yisrael is so important, how come you're all not going? And Yehuda Levi says, you got me. That is our root sin. Had we all gone back to Vayesheni, the Shechina would have returned. And basically he says in so many words, which I deal with a lot in the Sefer, that if we would all go back today, this is Yehuda Levi's day, in the 11th century, the Shechina would return. And Hashem was waiting for us. And there's a chapter in the Sefer called Ha'im Be'emes Ha'geula Tuluya Ha'geula Banu. Is the Geula really dependent on us? Because I want to know that. If the Geula is waiting, if Hashem is waiting for us to return, that's something that we should think about, right? But so says the Avnei Nezer, you can't bring a raya from the masses not returning that we shouldn't, because Yehuda Levi already said that that's a tremendous sin. And in his day, he basically called for everyone to return, and they still haven't listened. But says the Avnei Nezer, that explains the Hamoinam. What are you going to say about all the tzaddikim, the Hasidim, and the Yechidim? Why didn't they take an opportunity to go back to Eretz Yisrael? So the Avnei Nezer, I'll just say briefly, maybe the Avnei Nezer and my treatment of it. The Avnei Nezer himself says a really interesting thing. He says that the mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael is based on the fact that in Eretz Yisrael there's a direct shefa, direct hashpah of parnasa from Hashem, while in the other lands the shefa goes through the conduit of the Sarim, 70 malachim that surround the Kisei HaKavod. Therefore, says Avnei Nezer, shocking thing, and I don't think we're going to go into this too much. If a person's living in Eretz Yisrael but receiving his parnasa from Chutz La'aretz, he's not really doing the mitzvah. First, he says it's not the complete mitzvah. Then he says basically not mitzvah at all. Okay, now the Satmar Rav over here is massing on that. He says, you can't decide hilchos a mitzvah based on these kinds of kafshi d'achmon, these kinds of soidas. That can't determine. How can you make up something about a mitzvah based on these kinds of secrets? But what I show in the Sefer, and this has to do with the fact of, as you alluded, it has to do with the fact that whether there's a community there or individuals. What I show is that the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is not a mitzvah to be in a certain geographical location on the planet, like your body to be situated within these borders. The mitzvah is for Eretz Yisrael to be a land, to be your country. So let's say a person would be in Yerushalayim or in any place in the geographical location of Eretz Yisrael, but he's not receiving anything. He's not benefiting anything from the land. He doesn't have a community. He doesn't have parnasa. He doesn't have schools for his children. He has nobody to marry, et cetera, et cetera. He's not being mekayim the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to live there, to reside there, for that to be his residence. And I prove this from the Ramban himself, the Ramban who counts it as one of the mitzvahs. Ramban's the only one who counts it as a mitzvah in the Taryag. The Ramban himself moved to Eretz Yisrael at the end of his life. He gave a drasha in Akko on Rosh Hashanah, explaining what motivated him to move to Eretz Yisrael. and made no mention of the fact that it's a mitzvah in the Torah. He says that soul is so special. He talks about how special it is. And he says, because it's so special, I became cruel to my children. I abandoned my nachala. I left everything behind, and I came here to die, basically. He says, I wanted my neshama to leave in my mother's lap. That soul is mushal to the mother. So why did the Ramban reference the mitzvah? The answer is, in my opinion, and I show another source for this in the Sefer, the mitzvah is not to move to Eretz Yisrael and leave behind your family and leave behind your nachala. That's not the mitzvah. If your family can't come along because it's not a there's no community that will support the Ramban's family, or for whatever reason they couldn't come, so the Ramban has to leave them and live by himself. That's not what the mitzvah is. The mitzvah is that should be your land. You have to make it into your land. The Ramban starts the mitzvah. The prime mitzvah, the primary mitzvah is lichbaish, so to capture it and to make it into our land. So even the Ramban holds it's also a mitzvah to live there without capturing it. There's a mitzvah on the yachid to live there even if he doesn't capture it. But it's only a mitzvah to live there as a land. It's not a mitzvah to go there as an individual when it's desolate. Maybe you'll find some kedusha there, and maybe there's good reasons to go, even in that circumstance, as the Ramban himself says. But the mitzvah, the full promise of Eretz Yisrael, depends on it being a full-fledged aretz that supplies what normal aretz supply: security, parnasa, society, et cetera, et cetera.
Very interesting. Now, the other couple of parts, I don't know what we're really going to get to. I have some general questions I want to ask you, but you also have the fifth part is miroilias begalus umasai. Then you have chelik vav is bias mitzvahs, the problem mitzvahs to libaris. Then you have chelik zayis is just brought in Yanish Eretz Yisrael. You go into the Levi, the Rambam, Ramban, a lot of other different things. First of all, I do want to ask you a couple of general things. We'll see if we have time to get back to some of those. First of all, you have a whole podcast series. That's what we did a previous episode on. So is the Sefer kind of, you put it all together into a Sefer, or it's different in the podcast series, which again, you can mention that people can listen to.
Yes, I have the podcast, The Great Sources. So season 2 was going through the subject of Eretz Yisrael. And what was wonderful for me was that I was writing as I was giving those audio shurim. So giving the shurim on the podcast helped me structure the Sefer, and vice versa. Writing it, putting it in writing helped me structure the shurim. So that was wonderful. The Sefer is basically a summary of all those audio shurim. There's not much more here. Some things are slightly different, but it's basically the same thing. The one major difference is that in the Sefer, I do something which, in my opinion, is enough to make the Sefer worthwhile, which is in the 7th chelik, where I go through the idea of Eretz Yisrael. I have the first 3 prakim. I explain what the concept of Eretz Yisrael is according to Yehuda Halevi, or why it's important. Why does the Torah care so much about Eretz Yisrael? What it is according to the Ramban, that's another parak, and what it is according to the Rambam. And that's something I didn't go through in the series. And as we were talking before, there's so much. You have all these sources, and then they work against each other, and there's sometimes confusion. And I did something very important here, which I showed each one is its own system, its own shitah, and people are familiar with the Ramban or Yehuda Halevi or the Rambam will see how it's all the shitah, how they think about Kol Kula. This is something I talk about, how we have to learn the Rishonim and their own systems and realize that each Rishon has its own way of thinking. But really aligning all the Rambans, all Yehuda Halevis, and all the Rambams, showing how they work in Eretz Yisrael. So I think that's very valuable. The rest of Chelik Zayin, where I talk about the idea of Eretz Yisrael, is full of ideas that I did discuss on my on the podcasts.
Okay, and earlier on you mentioned the physical. First of all, it's this beautiful like indigo blue, and it's like cloth cover. It's very nice. The other ones weren't cloth. It's very nice. Out safer. I think it's a nice, interesting, kind of unique design. Now, also you mentioned the maftach, the index here, which is nice, and that you can mention the maftach. I also want to talk about the sources. You mentioned a couple times the Rambam and the Ramban, and you mentioned Yehuda Halevi, and then Avi Nezer and the Satmar Rav. So, kind of, what are is it Rishonim and some Leilach Rainim? What kind of the sources do you use over here?
Right. So, I like looking at the maftach because it starts from Bereshis and it goes down to Mishnas Yaakov, which is my previous sefer, and everything in between. I did it in chronological order because I sort of like to see things that way. The Rishonim coming from the Gemaras, the Midrashim, and Achronim coming from that. And the sefer really draws on so much of the literature, Torah literature. I didn't count the number of Sfarim, but the number of sources is in the hundreds. Obviously, this is a sugya that's not unlike my other Sfarim where I'm really developing Tanakh on my own, an original way. Here I'm working, obviously, with all the sources. One of the things I use a lot, and if you look at the index, you see this, I use a lot of Midrashim. Of course, obviously, Tanakh and Chazal, Gemara, Yushalmi, Chulu, obviously. But there's also a lot of Midrashim that bear on this, and various Midrashim. And one of the things I did, I really put in a ton of effort to make sure that the work is thorough. I'm trying to put together, I write this in the end of the Sefer, that I hope this is a Mishnah Achrona. I really do. I really hope that this can be a final word on the subject. I put in so much work to put everything together and make sure I'm not missing anything and turning everything over so many times. And one of the things I did for that end is I went through various Midrashim that I hadn't gone through yet in full. I committed to really just reviewing them to make sure I'm not missing anything. So I went through Medrash Tehillim, I went through Hechalas, I went through Tanakh Belio, I went through Pirkei Belezer in full. So any Midrashim which I hadn't done, because I just didn't want there to be an important source in Chazal that I wasn't aware of. I really was trying to make this a very thorough sefer that's not missing anything. And by the way, there are beautiful Sfarim out there about Eretz Yisrael. We discussed some of them last time. What I tried to do here was say, this is definitive. And part of being definitive means I'm not going to bring something that doesn't have to be here, but is nice. And also, more importantly, I don't want to miss something that belongs. And that's why I made sure to go through the literature of Chazal to my best of my ability to make sure I'm not missing something. The other Sfarim that we have about Eretz Yisrael, so of course, the Yom Moshe, I think, is quoted the most of all Sfarim. Satmar Rav. Menchas Elazar has some truvas. There's by the famous truva of Rav Moshe about Eretz Yisrael being a mitzvah kiyumis, which I think is misunderstood. I deal with that too. Some people say, you tell them Eretz Yisrael, Rav Moshe, that's a mitzvah kiyumis, or it's not a chiyuvis, and people think that means you don't have to do it. That's what I show in the first chelik of the Sefer, that just because something is not obligatory, it's not written as an imperative, doesn't mean you don't have to do it. And I think Rav Moshe himself meant that, because Rav Moshe just writes, it's not a mitzvah chiyuvis, and therefore there are other considerations, like the difficulty of maasros. Let's see what other Sfarim are there. There's some modern Sfarim, some good Sfarim. The Nachlas Yaakov is a very nice Sefer, which I quote a few times. The Sefer Afar Kumi, of course, the title gives it away that he's, that's at the end, that he's pro Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And everything prior to that, so many Achronim and Rishayim.
And I want to jump in. That I think you kind of hinted at this. It's not, you didn't go in alphabetical order in the Mafseiches. It's like in chronological order, right, which is very nice. I want to ask you about haskamos, something that the Sefer does have the podcast series and have, is that you have haskamos on here. If you want to mention where you got haskamos from and haskamos.
Yeah, look, it was so important to me that this should be, I'm not coming to say, kablu daiti, this is it. It was very important for me to get haskamos, especially on a topic like this, which people can be triggered, right? As we discussed in the beginning, there's this conflation between the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, the chivas haaretz, and certain negative things that are associated with Eretz Yisrael, unfortunately. So it was very important for me to get that on this. I would have liked to, the people that I need haskamas from were those who stand for the yeshiva shavel, the right, the people should know they're behind it, right? That's the point. I mean, the fact that there are people that are more left-wing, let's call it, who would give us comments is obvious. So I have from a Rav Asher Weiss, and I spoke to him on the phone, and he wrote a beautiful haskama. He really liked the Sefer, as can be seen. Naftali Kafshitz also, who I spoke to, and Rav Zolin Schwartzman, who I spoke to by Arichas, I always speak to him often. These are from Eretz Yisrael. And then I have my Rebbe Rav Shlomo Feivel Shustel, and my father-in-law Chaim Gibber, and my Rebbe Bianco Drillman, who wrote a beautiful haskama. I'll tell you a little vignette about that in a minute. And the other Rosh Yeshiva of Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yafen, also wrote a beautiful haskama. Rabbi Drillman, speaking of the Satmar Rav, Rabbi Drillman originally, he was hesitant to give me a haskama, because I wrote in a footnote that I'm not sure how much the Satmar Rav meant to establish an eternal das Torah, a definitive das Torah. See, I feel like this is so delicate. I want to be so careful here. What I write in the footnote, let me see if I can find this one. Can't find it right now offhand. What I write is that the Satmar Rav had a battle to fight. And the battle that he was fighting was against the unholy alliance that developed between Zionism per se and Akiras Hadas. The Zionists were using Zionism, the concept of Eretz Yisrael, to uproot the Torah, to replace the Torah. And Satmar Rav had to fight against that with all the tools at his disposal. And I show that there are some allusions here and there in the Vira Moshe that he didn't necessarily mean to establish a final word, Lanetzach. This is, okay, I found it, it's on page Nun-Hey, footnote number 30. And I discussed this with the Bianca, I mentioned it to him. And when I brought the Sefer to him for haskamos, he said, no, I can't give you haskamos because you wrote that Satmar Rav didn't really mean it. And, so I said, wait, Rebbe, I'm very close to Bianca. I said, you have to look at the footnote and you'll see that I wrote with such covet. So after he read it, he says to me, no, you're Satmar Chassid. So my respect for Satmar Rav is in no way diminished by the fact that I have a different conclusion here in terms of the halacha l'maaseh today. And I think this is a very important point to make to our listeners. This question has to be revisited every once in a while. The question of Eretz Yisrael today in 2023 is not the same as the question in 1948 or even in 1970 or even in 1990. Realities change. Chinuch changes, Parnasa changes, the government changes, Zionism changes. In other words, how much is a Chibas Haaretz run a risk of Akiras Hadas? That changes with the times. And Baruch Hashem, what I see is that that's diminishing. And that's why I think the time is right for us to re-engage with this question, There's Baruch Hashem so much Chibas Haaretz out there. I wanted to also give Torah that people could learn this as a sugya. Recognize as a sugya and needing to learn, same way we learn any other sugya. Let's jump into this and let's at least study it and then see what to do.
So is that what you're trying to accomplish here? Clarify, as we talk about, clarify this sugya with the complicated questions and, give people something to learn up and to be able to read up more on this Inyan.
Something to learn up, and obviously Talmud Shem Be'evul Demaisa. I think the more of us that engage with it, the more it'll be easier for us to make the move and figure out when it's right for us to go there. I want to give people the tools to learn it, to think about it, to talk about it, to study it, and Talmud Be'evul Demaisa, we'll see how that happens. We'll see what it does to them, and of course, each individual has his own circumstances, obviously, and I'm here, right? We're not here to talk about me. We're not here to talk about you. I'm in Brooklyn. At least I'm studying Eretz Yisrael. The least I can do is learn it. And I think by learning about it and by creating that conversation, it'll become, we'll figure out what to do and how to do it. And it'll become easier for us to do the mitzvah that the Torah requires from us in this thing.
Okay, I'll link to to the Sefer in the shows that people can purchase it. I just want to ask you, finally, you mentioned the podcast, great sources. I can link to that as well. You mentioned you want to mention your email that listeners can reach out to you. And if any future projects, you also have a Substack now. And if you want to mention any of that to the listeners.
Okay, yeah, sure. No, I definitely want people to reach out. My email, the best email is oros.yaakov@gmail, oros.yaakov@gmail. Please, any criticism of the Sefer, any kashas, I definitely want to engage and have a conversation, create this conversation. Yes, I also started a series, a very fascinating thing. I don't know if we have much time here, but a series of essays. It's called Unapologetics. And what I'm trying to do in that series is an English language series. I'm trying to bring out some core ideas of the Torah in a language that's Shaveh L'Chol Nefesh, that people could read really the depths of the Torah, the depths of the idea of a certain parsha, but without giving all the drush background, just really getting to the core idea. So that if you're interested in that, take a look, subscribe, and there's so much to learn from that.
Okay, so I'll add all that information in the show's notes that listeners can check it out. Thank you, Rav Shnayor, for joining me once again.
Thank you so much, Nafi. Pleasure to be here.